Hello everyone, this is Brian McClanahan again, and today we're going to talk about the rest of the South and the Celtic culture. And of course, this Celtic culture is going to have a tremendous impact on the frontier of the South and also on Southern culture in general. So I mentioned in the last presentation that Southern culture really was a mix of Cavalier culture, Celtic culture, and African culture. But we're going to look at the first two. Cavalier, we looked at that in the last presentation. And then, of course, today we're going to look at Celtic culture. And Celtic culture is going to have more of an impact on the frontier regions, what they call the Piedmont or the backcountry. Cavalier culture is going to dominate in the Low Country, the Tidewater of Virginia, the plantation areas of the South, along the coast, and then of course that will move in. Celtic culture will initially dominate in the upcountry, the areas that we would call the backwoods. So, and of course then it's going to have an impact as people move west and more Celtic peoples arrive in what will become the United States. And then also as that Celtic culture spreads to other parts of, say, the lower South. And so, again, this mix of Celtic and Cavalier culture is going to be known as Southern culture later on. But what we're first going to do is talk about the founding of the other Southern colonies. We looked at Virginia. So now we're going to talk about Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Just a brief overview on how they were established. And of course, how they were similar to, say, Cavalier culture or the Cavaliers, or different. And so the first would be Maryland. Now, most people don't think Maryland is a Southern colony, but it was. In fact, Maryland was considered a Southern state all the way up until 1865, and even then beyond. There was a substantial population during the War for Southern Independence that supported secession. There were a large number of Confederate soldiers from Maryland, and Maryland had this old Southern tradition. Now, it was founded in 1634 by the Calvert family. The Calverts were Catholic, and Maryland initially was seen as an outlet for English Catholics, and that's why it was established. You had, of course, a tremendous religious strife in England. At times you had the Catholics in power, at other times you had the Protestants in power. And so by the 1630s, the King of England, King Charles, decided that Catholics were facing too many troubles in Maryland, and he was very good friends with the Calvert family, and so these two families devised a way to get Catholics out. Now, there was always speculation that that Charles I and then later his sons, Charles II and James II, were actually Catholic, and of course James II was, but there was no clear evidence that Charles I or Charles II were, but at least they had some sympathies toward the Catholic people in England. And so Maryland will be founded as a result of that sympathy. Now, St. Mary's is the first settlement in Maryland, founded again in 1634. And the interesting thing about Maryland, of course, is named after Queen Mary, is that it will remain a proprietary colony all the way up until 1776. So it never goes into royal hands. And that's, quite interesting. Now, there will be some crown control of the colony, but it will remain a proprietary colony. And the Calverts will still have a role in it for a very long period of time. And this is why people like Charles Carroll of Carrollton in Maryland is able to have such a role in the proceedings leading to independence. He was a very strong Catholic and lived at Dorrigan Manor, but these Catholics, Catholic Marylanders are going to have prominent positions in society, and they're all in this part of this Cavalier culture. I mean, that's where they come from. These people are, so they support the king. They're generally, in the gentry of England, and it's just that they were Catholic instead of Orthodox Anglican. So Maryland is very similar to, say, Virginia in that way. It's a Cavalier society. Next, of course, we have the Carolinas, and the Carolinas were also a proprietary colony, and the Carolinas actually were led by a man named Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper. He was called the Earl, or his title was the Earl of Shaftesbury. He was also the founder of the Whig Party in England, and the Whig Party in England was an interesting situation. These were people that eventually were interested in limiting the power of the monarch, and so that tradition is going to carry over into the colonies. But it didn't mean they weren't part of the gentry themselves. In fact, they very much looked at society in a hereditary way. I mean, society should have an hereditary aristocracy, and essentially the Carolinas are set up that way. The Carolinas were founded in 1663. The first settlement would be Charlestown, which is now called Charleston, of course. And, for a long period of time, the proprietors ran the Carolinas, but eventually you would have some discord between North and South Carolina. Some of that was due to property holdings, but for the most part, what you're going to have here is a split. And the North Carolinians believed that they were not represented in the government like they should. And so in 1729, the Carolinas are going to be split into North and South Carolina. But again, the original charter, the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas, is very much a Cavalier culture document. And in fact, it was actually John Locke who helped write it. And of course, John Locke, the man that's so much responsible for the Enlightenment in England and the English Bill of Rights, but he's going to have a role in writing this fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas. And if you look at that document, and I've linked it on the PowerPoint, you can see that a lot of our interests, civil liberties, for example, in the Carolinas, are there. For example, the right to bear arms. I mean, it's there. This document was very interesting and very important for the establishment of civil government and the way the Southerners are going to look at government in the South. And it's a nice example of that, of how they look at things. Again, very much influenced by Cavalier culture. And finally, we have Georgia. Now, if there was any odd colony in the South, it would be Georgia. Georgia was always seen, even past the colonial period, into the 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century, even into the mid 19th century. It was always seen as kind of the odd colony in the South, and that's because its founding was slightly different. It was founded by a man named James Oglethorpe in 1732, and Oglethorpe wanted to have what you might call a socialist utopia in Georgia. His first settlement was Savannah, and first large settlement was Savannah. And Oglethorpe, for example, looked around at the other colonies and thought, okay, well, there's some problems here. For example, we have Catholic and Protestant troubles, so Catholics were not allowed in Georgia. We have problems with Indians, so rum was not allowed because rum, of course, would be traded to the Indians. We have problems with, perhaps landholding size, so slavery was not allowed, and landholdings were limited. But what Oglethorpe realizes very quickly is that this stuff isn't going to work. In fact, almost all his restrictions on all these things very quickly evaporate as the Carolinians move into Georgia and acquire more land, of course, bring slaves. So this socialist utopia rapidly falls apart. And by 1751, Oglethorpe had given up and just given it back to the crown. So Georgia is only a proprietary colony for a very brief amount of time, and then it reverts to royal status, and Oglethorpe's out of the colonial business. Okay, so we've got these colonies. We've got Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And let's look at Celtic culture, because Cavalier culture dominated in the Carolinas, in Maryland, and Virginia. But then again, you had the frontier regions. And so what were the people like here? Well, these are the Celts. And the Celts are going to arrive primarily from North Britain, basically Ireland and Scotland, in successive waves. They don't just come at one time. They don't come, say, for example, in 1650, the Celts show up. The Celts arrive from the early settlement periods all the way up until the 18th century. Most came with thoughts of material betterment, so they're looking for wealth. They're looking to get away and have land. And it's a mixed group of people from all classes of society. Some of these people were very wealthy, some of these people weren't. Different religions, though most, if you had to pinpoint a religion, most you would say were Presbyterians. And again, they're going to settle in the backcountry of the colonial North America. Now, some of the most famous Americans in history, particularly in the antebellum period, are part of this Celtic culture. People like Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun and Patrick Henry, Sam Houston. In fact, there's a great book written about this entitled Cracker Culture, Celtic Ways in the Old South, written by Grady McWhinney and Forrest McDonald. And what they do is kind of look at the impact of this Celtic culture on Southern tradition and Southern culture. It's a wonderful book, and I've given you the title of it in your PowerPoint presentation, and I'd highly recommend reading that book if you want an understanding of this Celtic influence on Southern culture. Now, as in Cavalier culture, there are certain things that define Celtic culture. So, for example, speechways. the way people talk. We saw that with Cavalier culture, and you're going to see it here with Celtic culture. If you want to, think about what Celtic speech was like, just listen to your country western singers and cinematic cowboys. I mean, that's Celtic speech. So instead of saying, for example, fire, they said far. Instead of saying widow, they said widder. Instead of saying young ones, they said youngins. If they're getting ready to do something, they're fixing to do something. And you don't hear that term fixing really outside of the Deep South today. But that was a Celtic term. If you were to say, I'm fixing to do something in Pennsylvania, people would look at you like you've got two heads, because that's just not a term that they hear. But it's definitely a Southern term, and it's carried over into the modern South. They use the term honey as a term of endearment. I mean, so this is very much a Southern term, and it's Celtic. That's where it comes from. And again, if you go into North Britain, Ireland, Scotland, places like that, they perhaps would still use some of these terms today because that's where it comes from. So this speech is definitely going to define the Celts in so many ways. Marriage, just like in Cavalier society, marriage, the way people get married, says something about culture. And in this particular case, we have voluntary and involuntary abductions, meaning that as part of Celtic tradition, wives would be stolen. And, of course, the husband who was married to her could either fight to get her back or just let her be stolen. And it's interesting. I'm going to give you a little story about that in a second. But even into the period of colonial history when you no longer stole someone's wife, that was still part of the ceremony. You would ride your horse up to the house, kick the door in, go in and throw the bride over your shoulder, take her to the ceremony, and that's how you'd marry her. And, that was part of the process. I mean, it's part of the ceremony. So, these ceremonies also involve great parties at the end. Wild parties of shooting, dancing, kissing. I mean, this is a fun time. Of all the cultures in North America at this point, the Celts would have to be the most fun, though I wouldn't necessarily want to eat with them. They were also very violent in so many ways. So there was also that element to it as well. And these marriage parties could last for days. Now, I bring up this voluntary and involuntary abduction and how marrying someone else's wife was actually accepted in Cavalier culture at times. Well, when we get into the antebellum period, of course, you're going to talk about Andrew Jackson. And one thing that's interesting about Andrew Jackson, when he married his wife, she was actually still married to another man. So she was a bigamist. And now she was in the process of getting a divorce, but it wasn't official. And when Jackson is running for president, this is brought out in a very dirty 1828 campaign. And when Jackson's elected, his wife is actually going to have a heart attack before the campaign, and she'll die. And the man who brought that out, of course, is Henry Clay. And Jackson always had problems with Clay, and this was just another nail in the coffin in the relationship. But Jackson was very much part of this Celtic culture, so it's illogical to think this could happen. Child rearing ways that people rear children, just like in Cavalier society, where you had these formal rules of conduct, you would have defined gender roles in Celtic culture as well. Boys, for example, were to have fierce pride, stubborn independence, and a warrior's courage, whereas girls were expected to have industry, obedience, patience, sacrifice, and devotion to others. So very clearly defined gender roles in terms of how boys and girls were to conduct themselves, and then later men and women. But you also have to say that children had immense freedom. That children had to have their will built, not broken or bent, but they were building their will. So in the South, you had this very strong independent streak, very strong will among both men and women. And that independent streak, of course, is part of the reason why they're living on the frontier, trying to get away from government and society, particularly the English, over time. But that independence is, of course, going to play a role in how these people view society later on. And that's going to have a strong impact on the South as well. For example, Patrick Henry, very much part of this culture, had that very strong independent streak, was pushing for independence and thought Virginia should be independent long before independence actually happened. So this is very much part of this child rearing process, and then, of course, Celtic culture in general. Religions. Most of the Celtic peoples had an intense hostility towards organized religion, but they had a natural curiosity for it. And what's interesting, of course, is over time, as the Great Awakenings will spread to the South, it's the Celts that are very much going to be influenced by that early on, because they really don't have any organized religion. And these Great Awakening revivals would go into the frontier parts of the South. And, of course, today, if you look at your Congregationalist churches, the Baptist and Methodist churches, they're the dominant churches in the South. And as that most of these Celts were Presbyterians to begin with, that congregationalism can have an impact there. And of course, Presbyterianism is a much more democratic church than, say, the organized or the Orthodox Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. So this is going to have an impact on the frontier, and of course will allow this Great Awakening and the field meetings that these people had to influence religion in the South. So you can go back to this early period of the Presbyterian dominance on the backcountry, these field meetings instead of organized churches, and that's the reason why you're going to see the Great Awakenings have an impact like they do later on the frontier in particular. Foodways. If there's any culture that I wouldn't want to eat with, it would have to be the Celts. These people had a very poor diet. They ate clabber, which is spoiled milk, bacon, butter, potatoes, cornbread, whiskey, and water. And in fact, one traveler called these people, they said that they had an animal's diet, so it's not a very pleasant thing. And boiling was the common method of cooking. You just kind of boiled everything together, and you might have one pot, and that pot would be used for everything, bathing and cooking. And they didn't always change the water. So that's because they saw dirt as an essential component of a good meal. In fact, they had a saying, the more dirt, the less hurt. And so, this is these people didn't necessarily have the best diet and the best, most healthy lifestyle, but and people didn't really like to spend much time in their cabins. And that's also interesting about Celtic society. We look at plantation homes and you think, well, everyone in the South had these large plantation homes, but really most of the homes were not large. Even the large planters didn't have large homes. And on the frontier, they had cabins, they had cow pens, and they often slept inside with their animals to keep warm. I mean, this is a very poor society. And as you go through time and you look at, say, for example, the conditions of slaves and the poor conditions they had in their cabins, oftentimes, white Southerners on the frontier, and then not just on the frontier, in other parts of the South had the exact same living conditions. So, if you compare slavery, for example, with the plantation homes, of course, it's the dichotomy there is tremendous. But when you start comparing apples to apples, which is how many poor Southerners lived, and even middle class, what you would call a middle class Southerner, they didn't have it much better in terms of living conditions. And now, of course, their labor wasn't owned by someone else; they had that freedom. But in terms of their actual physical living conditions, they generally weren't that much better. So you can definitely see that with Celtic culture. Now, in terms of work, most men in Celtic culture preferred war to work. These people were warriors. That was part of the way they were reared. So they would often spend more of their time out hunting or fighting if they could, rather than farming. Farming was the primary mode of occupation for the people in Celtic culture, and they had what were called infields, which is where you grow your primary sustenance crops. Then you have your outfields. If you could have some cash crops, that's how you would do it. There was some small-scale manufacturing of clothing, and it must be said that women worked very hard in Celtic society as well. There wasn't the pampered woman like you would have, say, in Cavalier society. Women worked very, very hard, and that was generally the way things were done on the frontier. You couldn't just sit around and fan yourself all day if you were a woman, and you had to work, and you had to work very hard at that, and the men had to work very hard too. So hard work was shared by both men and women in this society. Living on the frontier is tough. And then, of course, you had wealth. In this society, land was the most important commodity. Many people didn't own land. A lot of people were squatters or tenants, just like they were back in North Britain. But squatting meant that the land was essentially yours. You just didn't have a title to it. And for the most part, these people were so far removed in the frontier, no one's going to kick them off anyways. So land was seen as a way to better yourself in society. There was a middle-class yeomanry here, and I put middle-class in quotations, a middle-class yeomanry here in Celtic society. But the middle class is, we look at classes kind of in this, class comes out of this Marxist analysis of the South and Marxist analysis of society. Class wasn't so defined. I mean, there was a caste system, say here in Celtic society, but it was more of a warrior caste system. Who was the best warrior? Who was the most respected man? Those were generally the most respected people in society. The more land you had, of course, the better, but oftentimes they looked at character and ability as well, not just land. There were fewer large landholders than on the Atlantic seaboard here in Celtic society. But for example, Patrick Henry had a tremendous amount of land, so it was possible. Andrew Jackson had a large plantation. People did get large plantations in Celtic society, but they were still Celtic. They weren't Cavalier. And finally, power and liberty. Personal government was the most important thing in Celtic society. You had to have very strong personal leadership. And so when I talk about, building the will and this independent streak, this immense freedom that people had, that played a role in the way they looked at government. Your clans and your small communities were more important than the central authority. So just like in Cavalier society where your plantation was your country, and then you had your county, and then you had your state, and then you had your central authority, that's exactly the way the Celtic peoples looked at it too. You had your clan or small community, then you might have your county, then your state, then your central authority. And so these clans, this very small local government was more important than anything else. So this tradition of small local government, in the South had nothing to do with slavery early on. That's what the left would like you to think, that, it's just all slavery. That's why these people want states' rights for local government. They just want to perpetuate slavery. Well, this goes all the way back to the colonial period. The respect for local authority, for local autonomy, for independence, fighting tyranny by armed resistance. That's what Patrick Henry was saying in his very famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. That was important. And that comes out of culture. It wasn't something that was fabricated to defend slavery or some other political system. This is the way things were done culturally from the 1600s forward. So that is the important thing to get out of Southern culture. This resistance to this strong central authority has always been there from the colonial period forward. It wasn't created in 1861. It wasn't created in 1833 with nullification or 1798 or any time the South talked about secession. It was created in the 1600s, and it was created before that when these people were already moving over to the New World on their own hook. That's something else you have to look at with all the Cavaliers and the Celts. These people came on their own hook with their own, they're on their own blood and own money. This was a tough trip. And to carve out something for yourself on the frontier was not easy to do. So these were very independent, fiercely independent people. They of course, they believed in light taxes and very minimal government. And that's culture that was ingrained in them. So, when you start putting Southern culture together, you have to put this Cavalier culture that we talked about in the last presentation with this Celtic culture. And of course, that's going to have a tremendous impact moving forward. It's drastically different than what you're going to find, say, in, New England. Even though the people in New England, the Puritans, were also independent in so many ways, but they believed in a little different system of government there. And of course, also in Quaker society in the Mid-Atlantic area, which I'll look at in the next discussion. So, this creation, as we get forward and we start looking at the 1860s and later in the course, when people start talking about creating Southern nationalism, well, this Southern culture was already there, and it had really nothing to do with slavery. Southern culture, the way that the South conducted itself, had been there since the 1600s. And that's one of the most important things you can take away from these two discussions, is this creation of Southern culture and the components that lead into it. Okay, well, in the next presentation, we will talk about Quaker culture in the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and I'll look in some detail at, say, the establishment of Pennsylvania and New York, because those two are so much, in many ways, the hub of the Mid-Atlantic area. Okay, I'll see you.